you could hear that Gusher come in there with the howling, worst howling wind that you ever heard in all your life. Scare people nearly to death.
The range of emotions that this brought forth from the community. Some people were elated, some people were excited but wondered what it all meant, and some people were terribly afraid.
10 days into the 20th century, an event on this Texas Gulf Coast prairie would forever change how we live. A single stream of crude shooting into the sky would fuel the development of automobiles and airplanes, speed up shipping, revolutionize the railways, pave a national highway system, and make electricity a part of everyone's vocabulary. America was about to charge into the new century and to world dominance, in part because of a hole drilled into a small rise called Spindletop. At the height of its glory, the Spindletop oil field would see 5,000 derricks squeezed into a 150-acre tract, produce 42 million barrels of oil in less than a decade. It would topple a monopoly, create multi-million-dollar corporations, turn farmers into millionaires, and the city of Beaumont into a madhouse. Across the country, the wheels of the Industrial Revolution were picking up steam. William McKinley was president. A young Ford was working to perfect the internal combustion engine. Thomas Edison was turning on the lights, and a pair of bicycle builders named Wright were flying kites. In the wake of the discovery would come one of the greatest eras of progress and prosperity ever known to man.
At noon today, a report reached the city that oil was flowing from a well recently sunk 3 miles south of the city by Mr. A.F. Lucas. Mr. W.R.J. Strafford brought the report. He says he was out on the Sabine and East Texas Railway watching from a distance the oil operators when suddenly he saw a string of pipes shoot high into the air. A terrific report followed, and then there gushed into the air a stream of oil which reached a height of more than 100 feet. The Beaumont Journal, January 10th, 1901.
The Lucas Gusher was a natural phenomenon never witnessed before on the face of the earth. It showered the prairie with 100,000 barrels of oil a day at a time when the largest wells produced less than 100. No well had ever arrived with the force of the Lucas number 1. Yet one man who joined the thousands of excited spectators rushing to the Gusher had seen it all before. Patilla Higgins was a map maker, draftsman, inventor, artist, engineer, self-taught geologist, and a dreamer. A decade before the boom began, Patilla Higgins stood on the same hill and prophesied the day. He not only predicted within 500 yards the spot where the well would come in, but he also foretold within 20 feet the depth at which the pool of oil would be found. He was born the third child of a southern gunsmith who missed a California-bound ship in Sabine Pass and decided to stay. Higgins' family moved to the thriving lumber town of Beaumont, 30 miles inland, following the Civil War. Growing up on the streets, he earned a reputation as a quick-tempered bully who, as a teenager, never left home without his 6 guns. In 1881, at the age of 18, Patilla Higgins led a party on a shooting spree through Beaumont's black community. An exchange of gunfire killed a sheriff's deputy and wounded Higgins. He beat a murder charge in court, but lost his left arm at the elbow. A judge ordered Higgins to leave town. He spent the next 4 years in the woods along the Louisiana-Texas border, cutting timber and floating it to sawmills down the Neches River. Fellow loggers boasted he was one of the best rafters on the water. Patilla Higgins couldn't swim. In 1885, a Baptist tent revival played a crucial role in the discovery of the abundant crude along the Gulf Coast. It was there Higgins got religion and took a young Sunday school class under his charge. Remembering a place he frequented as a youngster, Higgins took his class to Big Hill. Like their teacher, the kids were fascinated by the hill's sulfur-smelling waters. To their amusement, Higgins would poke a cane into the hill and set the escaping gas on fire. These lessons would not be forgotten. In 1886, while riding through a field in Orange County, Higgins discovered a patch of clay suitable for brick making. Using borrowed books from the library, Higgins built the first commercial brick kiln in southeast Texas. The brick company enjoyed immediate success. The search for a superior brick led Higgins to Pennsylvania, where oil had been discovered in 1859 at Titusville.
He wanted to establish a brick kiln. Well, the newest ones were firing with oil and natural gas. That is what introduced Higgins to petroleum as an energy resource. And reading up on how they did it in Pennsylvania, following the oil seeps, following the sulfurous water, the flammable gas, things like that, he became convinced that under this low rise of land called Spindletop, or Big Hill, that there was going to be an oil field there.
Higgins returned to Texas and gained respectability after providing the bricks for a new 3-story courthouse, the first public brick building in the area. Diving into the study of geology with the same appetite he showed for theology, he soon began to preach his oil field prophecy. Higgins convinced a Beaumont Lumber Company president, George Carroll, attorney landowner George O'Brien, and other prominent businessmen to listen to his pitch.
Yes, part of his prospectus included Gladys City. He had made out a map was showing residential areas and parks and properties for schools and a college and an industrial park that was going to be fueled by his oil field.
Impressed with the man and his idea, the investors agreed to finance 3 wells on a 2,700-acre lease that covered most of the rise. The Gladys City Oil, Gas, and Manufacturing Company was chartered 9 years before the Lucas Derrick was constructed. Named for a little girl in Higgins' Sunday school class, the company's letterhead featured the likeness of Gladys Bingham. The first assault on the hill began a year later despite protests by the mastermind, who said the Dallas drilling crew was under-equipped. Higgins was right. The first hole pushed no deeper than 300 feet. 2 more attempts by West Virginia drillers failed after quicksand and natural gas collapsed the holes. What the drillers lacked was not determination, but technology. The drilling fueled gossip on the streets of the quiet timber town. The failure frustrated investors and threatened their credibility among the financial leaders in the community. Higgins, the man of dreams, became the whipping boy for the company. Townspeople laughed in his face and tagged him with the nickname Mr. Millionaire. In one last effort to save face and the company, Patilla Higgins called for a second opinion. Without the knowledge of his partners, he asked a state geologist to verify his theory. When he didn't, Higgins quickly ushered him out of town. Days later, an unsolicited letter appeared in the Beaumont Enterprise.
Situated as she is in the center of a very fertile region, practically holding the very key to the deepwater port of the state, Beaumont ought to lay herself out so as to form a transfer point for commerce. There are hundreds of ways by which this can be done without frittering her money away upon the idle dream or insane notions of irresponsible parties in the vain outlook for either oil or useful gas. William Kennedy, Assistant State Geologist.
Only days after the Spindletop discovery, Kennedy and Higgins would bump into each other on the crowded Beaumont streets. Now there was a mortified man, Higgins said. I can still hear him saying, "Well, Mr. Higgins, I was a little wrong about the oil, wasn't I?" Higgins replied, "A little wrong? Ye gods, man, you were just a few $1 billion wrong, that's all." In 1896, 5 years before the Lucas Gusher blew in, tired of the investors dragging their feet on further drilling plans, Higgins sold out his interest in the Gladys City Company. But the quest was far from over.
At 1 o'clock, Mr. Charles Ingalls, who resides near the well, came into the city by horseback. His clothing was saturated with oil, and he said that his house and everything in it was saturated. He confirmed the natural gas explosion and said that Mr. Lucas had struck an oil geyser. The Beaumont Enterprise, January 10th, 1901.
Big Hill, Sour Springs Mound, Spindletop Hill, all names for the rise just north of Taylor's Bayou. The sulfur waters and springs bubbling with natural gas that first attracted people to the mile-round hill no longer exist. But according to folklore, the Indians were the first to claim the hill had mystical powers. Early settlers used the springs for medicinal purposes, drinking the water themselves and dipping their animals in the colored waters to heal injuries and kill ticks and fleas. Many stories tell how this place became known as Spindletop. The most popular is that tall trees once stood on the top of the hill, and passing by on a hot day, the hill appeared to spin like a top. It was not oil, but sulfur and salt that attracted the man who would make Patillo Higgins' dream a reality. A decade of land purchases without a return had stretched Patillo Higgins' credit to the limit. Not only was he forced to sell out his interest in Gladys City, but also more than 500 acres that would later bring $3 million during the coming boom. The dreamer needed help.
So he put an ad in the newspaper that here was an area that he thought oil can be found, and no mention of gas. It was always oil. Mentioned that oil would be found, and if anybody was interested to contact me. He only got one reply.
An Austrian-educated mining engineer, Captain Anthony Lucas, was working in Louisiana, extracting salt from the natural salt dome deposits when he answered the ad in 1899. Lucas had a theory that salt domes trapped oil. To prove himself right, Lucas bought up the Gladys City leases for $33,000. Higgins couldn't come up with any capital, but got 10% interest as a finder's fee. Lucas wasted no time moving his family and drilling equipment to Texas. After spending months and thousands of his own dollars drilling into the hill, the hole collapsed under pressure. Lucas did manage to capture a few quarts of crude from the well at 500 feet. Lucas landed the support of veteran wildcatters John Gailey and James Guffey of Pittsburgh. The pair managed to secure $300,000 from the Mellon Bank to drill 3 wells, but strings were attached. Lucas must keep the source of the money a secret, buy up more land around the hill, and cut Patillo Higgins out of the deal. While the captain was in Corsicana working out the details of a drilling contract, John Gailey made his first visit to Beaumont to survey the land and select a site for the first well. Mrs. Lucas showed Gailey the hill. He found a spot in the south side of the McFadden-Kyle-Weiss tract. Gailey walked to a spot near the 3 hog troughs filled with sulfur water and drove a stake in the ground. Had Gailey chosen a spot 50 feet either direction, the Spindletop strike might never have happened.
Shortly after the noon hour, the news of the spurting well had spread pretty generally throughout the city, and soon there was a tremendous rush for the livery stable, and the demand for horses, buggies, and teams became so great the stables weren't able to supply the needs. At this writing, there are probably several thousand people about the spurting stream. Beaumont Enterprise, January 10th, 1901.
In 1895, the petroleum industry came to Texas in a big way. A series of producing wells brought in by drillers looking for water in Corsicana attracted experienced independents and companies from the Northeast fields. What they learned in this central Texas town proved invaluable in the development of the Spindletop field. The first refinery in the Lone Star State was built in Corsicana and expanded the use of oil. Asphalt for streets became one of the first byproducts of oil refining. But most importantly, the Corsicana fields established the use of the rotary drill and gave birth to a company owned by brothers Al, Kurt, and Jim Hamill.
In August of 1900, we received a letter from Mr. John Gailey of Guffey and Gailey of Pittsburgh that a Mr. Lucas would call on us shortly. His purpose would be to get out a contract price for the drilling of a wildcat well located within just a few miles of Beaumont. Al Hamill.
The drilling crew of Al Hamill, Brother Kurt the derrick man, Peck Bird the fireman, and driller Henry McLeod arrived in Beaumont the first day of October 1900. And already they were solving the first of many problems they would face.
In fact, one of the interesting tales is of the Hamill brothers having a carload of pipe, their drill pipe, shipped into Beaumont, and wanted to hire a contractor to offload this carload of pipe. And they didn't know how to handle it. Well, the Hamills just literally grabbed one end of a section of pipe and threw it off the car.
Little did they know, when they built the first derrick of East Texas timber, they would achieve celebrity status and go on to build dozens of others in the same field. 75 days and many challenges later, they danced on this derrick floor, soaked in oil.
When we got out to the well site, we found an old cabin or shack we were to camp in. In cleaning it out, we found it was almost alive with all kinds of bugs, roaches, and frogs. And as the room was not sealed, these little frogs seemed to be in the rafters. They would jump out and land on the table while we were eating. The mosquitoes were terrible. Kurt Hamill.
The Lucas No. 1 was spudded into the hill on December the 27th, 1900. The Hamills were men of skill, resourcefulness, and true ingenuity. They were inventing drilling technology as they tackled the mystery of the hill.
And another first that occurred on Spindletop was the use of drilling mud. There's one of those affectionate tales that the Hamills ran Charlie Ingall's cattle around the slush pit to stir up the mud, and realizing that the mud, as it flushed into these sands that they were encountering, that the mud would tend to stabilize the sand.
The Hamills learned that by running their drill 24 hours a day, they could keep the hole from collapsing. They reached the depth of 880 feet in hard rock by December. According to the salt dome theory of Captain Lucas, the oil lay just beneath the rock. Excitement gripped the crew when oil deposits showed up in the pipe one night, but a week of all-out effort failed to bring in the well. Christmas was coming, and the crew, which had shrunk to 3, was exhausted. They took the week off, shutting down the well, hoping for better luck in the new year.
January 1st, 1901, we were back on the job. In the following 7 days, we made 120 feet of hole, making a total depth of 1,020 feet. I met the train in Beaumont on the morning of the 10th. We put on a new bit and started drilling again, when mud started flowing through the rotary. It came so fast and with such a force that Kurt, who was up on the double boards, was drenched with mud and water, and had a hard time getting out of danger. Al Hamill.
The crew scrambled to clear the deck. 20-foot joints of pipe shot out of the hole like missiles. Rocks blew hundreds of feet into the air. Almost as quick as it started, the blowout was over. The crew returned to the derrick to find it covered with mud. Before they could catch their breath, there came a rumble that shook the countryside. The geyser erupted. Captain Lucas didn't witness the first blowout. When he reached the well, he found a celebration underway. Men screaming over the roar, a river of crude flowing onto the prairie. Captain Lucas built a series of dikes to control the quickly rising lake of oil. In the end, more than 50 acres of land would be covered by nearly 1 million barrels of crude. The Gusher ran wild for 9 days before the Hamill brothers once again did what had never been done before. They capped a Gusher.
John B. Gailey, one of the most prominent oil promoters in the United States and one of the capitalists backing Captain Lucas in his oil investigations here, arrived in the city last night from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Mr. Gailey bears the distinction of having developed more oil fields than any other man in the country. The Beaumont Journal, January 14th, 1901.
Perhaps the first person to really cash in on the Lucas find was a young photographer from Port Arthur. Frank Trost was working in his studio on January 10th when a friend stopped by with news of a giant Gusher. Thinking there might be an opportunity for a photograph, Trost loaded up his equipment. Arriving at the scene by wagon shortly before 5, Trost snapped the first picture ever taken of the spectacular well. He and his brother spent the next 6 months making copies for souvenirs, earning a reported $25,000. The Trost name would become synonymous with oil-field photography. Patilla Higgins, who'd been surveying land in Hardin County, was probably among those who witnessed Trost take aim that afternoon. The oil that shot through the derrick top that day brought him no money, but did earn him the respect of his fellow townspeople, and that for the moment would be vindication enough. With his prophecy proven, Higgins wasted no time forming a company to drill on his own 16-acre tract atop the mound. 4 months later, on the 18th of April, the Higgins Oil Company would bring in its first gusher, the 6th straight of the Spindletop find.
In the twinkling of an eye, Beaumont was converted into a mass of seething, fighting, shouting, money-mad adventurers. All the commonplace sources of mere livelihood and legitimate profit were forgotten, while every mind centered upon the dark column roaring its message of treasure. Everybody saw at least $1 million in their hands. Florence Stratton, Beaumont journalist.
The first trains to pull into the Southern Pacific Depot on the evening of January 10th carried hundreds of people eager to cash in on the black gold. It was the start of a boom that newspapers of the day described as bigger than the California gold rush and the Klondike combined. Telephone and telegraph spread the word of the wondrous well. Newspapers from London to New York would quickly fix the once sleepy town of Beaumont as a front-page dateline. 24 hours after Charlie Ingalls rode into Beaumont to spread the news, the city was awash with people.
But that news didn't fly fast. And of course, when father heard that news, I could remember him saying to my mother, Polly Ann, get them kids ready, because we're going on to that Beaumont, and we're going to get some of that gold coming up out of that ground. And so the next day we were ready to move over here, the day right after they thought they had struck oil out there.
Less than 2 years after the discovery of oil on Spindletop, the population of Beaumont jumped from 9 to 50,000, twice the size of San Francisco during the gold rush peak in 1850. The city was completely overwhelmed. Newspaper reports indicate the population during the daylight hours along Crockett and Pearl Streets reached 30 to 40,000. Unprepared for the rush, Beaumont found itself facing a tremendous housing shortage.
My first 3 nights in Beaumont left an indelible impression upon my mind. I paid $3 per night to sleep in the loft of Broussard's livery barn. The bed consisted of a limited amount of straw covered with a tarpaulin. It was a democratic bunch of men that roosted in Broussard's stable. Millionaires and working men alike tried to get a few hours' sleep. I'm certain I never heard a more wonderful exhibition of snoring. H.P. Nichols.
A bed was wherever you found it. Barbers rented out their chairs at night, families their spare rooms. Billiard tabletops went for $2, and many slept on the wooden sidewalks. The city rented its auditorium for sleeping space. Boarding houses sprang up all over town. Another serious shortage created quite a health hazard. Suitable drinking water was hard to find and more expensive than oil in the fields. There was a great deal of dysentery, typhoid fever, and malaria. One early boomer said the odor of the city water clearly indicated the presence of alligators, bullfrogs, and fish. Visitors soon learned that drinking the water caused severe stomach cramps and diarrhea, a malady that became known as having a case of the Beaumonts. Many enterprising young boys of the day found ways to cash in. Some would sell cups of water for 10 cents, more than 3 times the cost of a barrel of Spindletop crude. Others would offer their spots in lines at what few public toilets there were to the most desperate bidders. New arrivals walked the wooden sidewalks of the boomtown 24 hours a day. Police and sheriff's deputies guarded the entrance of restaurants where people lined up around the block to get a plate of ham and eggs that could cost the inflated price of $1. A 20-chair barber shop would open at 7 o'clock every morning to find 75 to 100 men waiting to get in. Barbers made $100 a week in commissions, nearly double that in tips. Bankers worked sunrise to midnight to handle the influx of cash into the city. Storekeepers became accustomed to having to make change for $1,000 bills, and freight cars were used to ship in silver dollars. While many local landowners and businesses would cash in on the boom, others were not so enamored with the crush of humanity.
And every space was taken, jams and so forth, traffic and everything. You can imagine the John Doe family sitting there in the quietness of their own solitude and wanting to do whatever they do every day, being disrupted. They can't go where they want to. They were afraid. There were all kinds of thieves and people coming into the city, and they took over.
The oil situation opened this morning with a briskness and activity that is refreshing. Men were astir early, and while dew was still on the earth, they were scattering to the four corners of the county, actively searching for lands and oil. The Beaumont Journal, January 28, 1901.
The Spindletop discovery sparked a frenzied rush for land and leases. Tracts near the well, which had sold for $8 to $10 an acre, were bought up for $200,000 to $900,000. Land as far as 30 miles away from the hill sold for as much as $40,000 an acre. Many large landholders became instant millionaires, but others were to find fortune as well. The story is told of a woman who barely eked out a living collecting garbage around the town. She sold her pig farm for $35,000. A store clerk who paid $60 for 4 acres sold it for $100,000. Not everyone came out so well. Farmer Charlie Ingalls, who claimed the Lucas well ruined his property, sold out to local prospectors for $4,000. 2 weeks later, it changed hands for $85,000. A black farmer returning to Beaumont shortly after the Gusher was met on the road by a man offering $20,000 for his farm. He sold, only to reach home and find a second potential buyer offering $50,000. All this happened before the quality of the Spindletop crude had been proven to have a market.
People were literally trading leases without ever even going out to look at the property, without ever registering their find, their purchase. They wouldn't even go to the county courthouse to register their deed of lease. They would just trade it off. And people were making money hand over fist by buying paper and selling paper without ever determining if it was valid.
The shortage of office space turned the lobby and bar of the Crosby House Hotel into the oil center of the world. It was not uncommon for gentlemen to flash hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and search for a single prime acre. Legend has it that more millions were made and lost on the Crosby House steps than on Wall Street in 1901. Street corners in downtown Beaumont became the office for thousands of so-called oil traders. Each arriving train was swamped by land and lease traders, offering the new arrivals an opportunity to cash in on the oil boom.
They were promoters, and so some of them were even so sneaky in their promotion that they would go ahead and they would go buy a well from someone because they had so much money coming in, and then they would go on and invite all of their clientele. There might be maybe 150, 20, whatever it is. Then put them on a train that came by Spindletop, and then the promoter would get up and say, "Now, our well was just now going to come in." And of course, that was all arranged, and so when the train come by, they'd open up the valve, all would shoot up in the air, and everybody would say, "My God, I'm rich."
One historian claims the final grand total of capitalization of Spindletop was close to $200 million. 4 months after the Lucas well blew in, Beaumont City Fathers created the Beaumont Oil Exchange and Board of Trade in hopes of keeping the boom above board as best they could.
Driving southward from the city, the monotonous view of houses gives way to a wide stretch of windswept prairie. and on the far distant horizon loomed the numerous well rigs and derricks. Of course, at a distance, the derricks seem to be huddled together, and one wonders how they can all operate in so small a space. Yet once on the ground, it is seen that they are widely spread. The Beaumont Journal, March 24th, 1901.
Only hours after the stream of oil knocked the top off the Lucas #1, others were making plans to put the fishtail bit back to the dirt. Higgins, Guffey and Gailey, the Haywood brothers, and D.R. Beatty, who allegedly turned $20 into millions, had derricks erected within days, and soon gushers became commonplace. The second gusher was brought in March 26th and only served to generate more excitement. But to Captain Lucas, it served to prove that the first was not a fluke. It also proved to skeptics, including the Standard Oil Company, which refused to get directly involved with the development of the field, that there was an abundance of oil along the Texas Gulf Coast. The captain became an instant national celebrity. The land he simply passed by jumped in price. Eventually, Lucas tired of the attention as the king of oil and would retire to his home in Washington, D.C. The story goes that Lucas would return to the site of discovery only once more in 1903, when derricks were literally standing side by side. He supposedly remarked, "They've milked this cow too hard."
My father opened a livery stable, run horse and buggy service from Beaumont to the field, and rented out to different people coming and going. My mother we had a very large house, 2-story, and my mother opened up a rooming and a boarding house, more like a little restaurant it was, because they ate all day long and fed the people coming and going, which was quite a few people out there at that time.
In the 9 days that the Lucas Gusher spouted oil into the air, thousands came to see the greatest natural spectacle of all time. Guards were hired in an attempt to keep the crowds from overrunning the derrick. On the third day, a group of 1,500 from Galveston left their train, surged past the hired help, and danced ankle-deep in crude. The mound outside of town soon became a destination point. Excursion trains ran on schedule from Chicago, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. Soon, a town sprang up on the hill, Gladys City, complete with saloon and gambling hall to accommodate the hundreds of spectators, but more importantly, those who came to find work on the rigs. The oil patch came to Texas, and with it, thousands of jobs for farmers and city slickers, educated and uneducated, most single between the ages of 17 and 25. Few had any experience to speak of, but were soon calling themselves derrick men, roustabouts, drillers, and boiler men. They would be the backbone of the field, building derricks, drilling holes, constructing holding tanks, and laying pipelines. The pay was top rate, $3 a day for helpers, twice the national average. Drillers could pull down between $5 to $15 a day, depending on their experience, but they all paid a price.
All of the horrific tales that you can find of people being exploited for commercial endeavor, all of that existed in the oil field. Kill a man, replace a man. Kill a mule, and it was costly. You could hire a man, but you had to buy a mule.
They gave me a death warrant, what they called a death warrant in those days, to sign. It read that I'm a white man, 21 years of age, realize that the work is dangerous, and assume all risks. R.R. Hobson.
Blowouts, falling pipe, and poison gas claimed the lives of untold numbers of workers. Accidents were an everyday occurrence. The biggest fear on Spindletop Hill became fire. A passing train sparked a fire just days after the Lucas Gusher came in. Everyone became aware of the consequences. The Hamill brothers soon started the practice of covering the wellhead with sand, a bit of early fire prevention. In March of 1901, smoke from a huge fire darkened the skies over Beaumont when the Gusher's reservoir caught fire and burned almost 1 million barrels. Further tragedy was avoided when a quick-thinking driller lit a backfire. The walls of the flames roared towards one another. The vacuum created was so strong it sucked the hats off workers. A thunderous explosion followed, and the fire was out. A series of fires nearly wiped out the hill in October of 1902. On the most populated track, the Hog Swain Syndicate, there raged a fire for 12 days that wiped out more than 35 derricks before being brought under control with the help of hundreds of townspeople. 2 days later, the smoldering mess was gone. New derricks erected. From that day forward, no wooden derrick would remain after a well came in. By October 1902, more than 440 gushers had been drilled on the hill. The men who worked hard to bring them in also played hard. Prostitution, gambling, drinking, and fighting were very much a part of daily life in the boomtown. There were more than 30 saloons on Crockett Street in Beaumont. Gladys City had its share as well. Each establishment also served as dance hall and gambling house. Good drinking water was hard to find and whiskey was cheaper. It is said that more whiskey was consumed in Beaumont than all of Texas in 1901. Shooting, stabbings, and ballroom brawls became part of the nightly routine at such places as the Log Cabin Saloon. Facing overwhelming numbers and a limited supply of jail cells, law enforcement officials could do little.
Yesterday was a day of rioting on Spindletop. Negroes were the object of the rioting, and one man, a cook at one of the camps, was badly beaten. The trouble started early yesterday afternoon when some white men, who it is reported were under the influence of bad whiskey, began to ride around the field making attempts to lasso Negroes whom they met with the avowed intention of hanging them. Several Negroes were caught in this way and dragged over the ground until they promised to leave the hill. The Beaumont Enterprise, November 10th, 1902.
Segregated to a community called Little or South Africa, the black man did more than his share to develop the field. They were teamsters, cooks, laborers, but almost never worked on the derrick floor. By August 1901, more than 500 companies had been created to tap the oil pool on Spindletop. The names were as colorful as the men who founded them. It was an independence paradise. Attila Higgins, the original wildcatter, did well for himself, forming two companies that prospered. But the prophet was not content to make money and spent most of the next 40 years searching and finding new fields along the Texas coast. Higgins Standard Oil Company was among the first to drill at Sour Lake in Saratoga in 1902, helped to bring in the next big Gulf Coast boom at Batson in 1903. He would also have a role in the development of Goose Creek and Humboldt before retiring to San Antonio. Though Higgins would see his dream proven, it was never quite enough. And until the day he died in June of 1955 at the age of 92, his quest would continue.
They were producing hundreds of thousands of barrels, for approximately 42 gallons in a barrel times hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil. And they had no tankage, no pipelining, no loading facilities, and certainly no refining capacity. But if you read through the newspaper reports, follow the industrial reports of that day, they built and acquired those facilities very quickly.
The influence of millions of barrels into the market dropped the bottom. By December 1901, oil was 3 cents a barrel, $2 less than the price in Pennsylvania when the Lucas well came in. That didn't stop drilling activity. Ex-Texas Governor James Hogg, who bought into the play in a big way, looked along with his partners to recoup their investment by selling drilling plots. The area soon became known as the Onion Field. Some of the plots were as small as 1/64th of an acre. The Hog Swain tract saw more than 300 wells. In 1902, the demand for oil as fuel began to increase as trains, electric companies, and warships were being converted. James Guffey's announcement that gasoline could be refined from Spindletop crude also served as a catalyst. With the development of the hill, producers quickly saw the need not only to develop the market, but to find a way to store and transport their product. Realizing the danger of keeping the crude in open reservoirs, wooden and steel tanks began to pop up all over the hill. Railroad tank cars were in short supply, and soon companies hired hundreds to construct pipelines to terminals in Sabine Pass and Port Arthur. Tankers were loaded and shipped to the Northeast for refining. The field's major players soon discovered the real bonanza was not only in the recovery of oil, but the refining and marketing of it.
And maybe they tied in with someone who had a financial acumen, and maybe someone who could knew something about land work, so they formed a little togetherness and they formed a company. And this is the way these companies grew, from one independent and another independent getting together.
Before 1901 was out, Guffey had won the support of the Mellon Bank in Pittsburgh to develop what would become the Gulf Company. 14 miles of pipe were laid, and the first stills of the Port Arthur refinery were built. At the same time, Governor Hogg joined forces with railroad magnate John Bet-A-Million Gates, former Standard frontman J.C. Cullinan, and others to form the Texas Fuel Company, better known today as Texaco. The Sun Oil Company built a terminal on the Neches River at Smith's Bluff to store thousands of barrels. It's believed the Standard Oil Company came to Beaumont through the back door after seeing the fountain of oil flowing from the hill. According to some historians, Standard, after losing its corner on the market, put up the financial backing for the construction of a $5 million refinery just 3 miles from Spindletop. Sold 9 years later to Galveston millionaire John Seeley, the Magnolia Company became one of the largest employers in Southeast Texas. It operates today as Mobil. In 1903, operators in the Spindletop field began to notice that each new well was producing less at lower pressures. The handwriting was on the wall. By 1908, the entire field was producing less than 5,000 barrels, a trickle of its former glory. Beaumont, the boomtown, seemed nearly deserted, but residents didn't seem to mind. They could enjoy the wealth without the worry. Spindletop gave the city its first opera house, several new banks, and dozens of millionaires with their plush houses along Calder Avenue. But earlier predictions that Beaumont would become the industrial center of the South never came true.
Beaumont had everything in any complex, industrial complex needed, but the people didn't want it. Now, when I say the people didn't want it, I mean those who controlled the town did not want it.
Derricks would cover the Spindletop field again. A second boom would shake the town in 1926, when a Beaumont geologist, Frank Yount, discovered large deposits of crude on the flanks of the hill at deeper levels.
Well, it's a little more saner. It wasn't quite as cuckoo and crazy as that first one was. That first oil boom was just absolutely wild.
Between 1901 and 1950, 2,200 wells were punched into the hill. The average acre on the hill produced 798,000 barrels, and the two booms accounted for more than 140 million barrels. It had helped propel the country through 2 world wars, a depression, and a rise to world power. Evidence of the Gulf Coast's role in the development of the petrochemical industry dots the landscape. The crude they process remains the lifeblood of many communities, employing thousands and returning millions into the economy. While domestic production and exploration has declined, the industry giants still depend on the Gulf Coast facilities for processing and marketing their products for international distribution. These plants have been the very cornerstone of an industry that influences virtually every aspect of our lives. The food we eat, the clothes we wear, the homes we live in are all directly affected by oil. The first major step into the energy age can be traced to a single hole on this coastal plain called Spindletop.